The message today is Wild Spirit, Meditations from the Wilderness. 1. Black Hills of South Dakota. Pahasapa means hills of black in Lakota. This region, geographically speaking, is an upheaval dome. The highest elevation is at the center, with descending elevations as you move away from that center until the land returns to the great flat plains. I grew up in eastern South Dakota, and each time we drove west on I-90, I would see the foothills dark on the horizon, the hills of black, named because of their thick pine forests rising out of the prairie, and the land would build higher and higher to the center, Black Elk Peak. Around that peak are rock formations known as the Needles, limestone caverns such as Jewel Cave, herds of bison, waterfalls that tumble down canyons, and wild rivers that hold rainbow trout. And just east of a place known as Icebox Canyon is where my father grew up. And this was the land I went to as a child, often multiple times a year, to play. We camped, fished, hiked, stood beneath waterfalls, and searched for wild lilies on the roadside. It was here that I learned about stewardship and relationship to the land. Being outdoors has always been my joy. It's where I become playful. I feel free of time, free of expectations for how I should behave or how my body should look. It's where curiosity is awarded with breathtaking views and new discoveries. American theologian and Baptist minister Walter Rauschenbusch wrote that play is anything we do for the joy and love of doing it, apart from any profit, compulsion, or sense of duty. It is the real living of life with the feeling of freedom and self-expression. If there is an inner spark or a soul, it is in this kind of play, in the outdoors, where it feels whole in me. Death of a loved one comes with all kinds of losses, as I'm sure you've all experienced. And when my dad died of cancer when I was 9, one of those many losses included the annual trips of beauty and wonder, awe and play in the Black Hills. That is, until my high school teacher helped me land a job guiding backpacking trips in the Black Hills for a Lutheran camp. That inner light sparked at the thought of reconnecting to that wonder and sharing it with others. I would have to leave the day after I graduated high school. I had never backpacked, and I wasn't Lutheran. You know, what could go wrong? I took the job. But something happened on that first training trip as I backpacked through the Black Hills. It was a big day, and as we came towards the end of it, I felt like I was in slow motion coming up the hill. The sun was at my back, illuminating the mineral mica. And that's a shiny mineral that had been ground by boot prints into the sparkling trail. The sun warmed the ponderosa pines, and they were releasing their butterscotch scent. As I crested the hill, Lake Sheridan stretched out before me, a place I had camped with my father when I was a child. And time stood still. A shimmer, almost like an aura, surrounded the lake and trees in that moment. I knew everything was going to be okay. I had a sense that everything was interconnected. I was them and they were me, and at the center of it all was a feeling like beauty or love. I don't know how long I stood there. I don't remember walking down the hill, but I do remember that night in camp crying, sobbing. I was trying to put it into words, this experience I'd had, but my fellow counselors were unprepared to process it with me. If I'd had a religious experience that perhaps included meeting Jesus on that trail or asking God into my heart, Perhaps they would have connected with me. That was the language of religious experience that they understood. So instead, they pointed towards dehydration or exhaustion, or perhaps it was a trick of my brain, an illusion or a delusion. That last possibility convinced me to keep quiet about what I had experienced, but it has never left me. When I imagine it, I can feel it, a oneness so vivid, so real. And I wondered, was it a message from my father? I wondered if the Pahasapa are the spiritual home of the Lakota people. Did I experience the spirit of the water, land, and trees? What was it? 2, Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. When I entered Northland College in Ashland, Wisconsin, I planned to study biology or natural resources. But after taking an ethics course and a religion class, I realized that I was drawn not to natural resource management or biological resource, but to this condition of humanity in relationship to nature. That was what intrigued me. That's what I felt called to. And so I did something so impractical for someone like myself. I became a religion and philosophy major. I coupled this with an emphasis in outdoor education with this intent to explore and to teach and to bring experiences like I had had, and perhaps to help heal that interconnectedness between humans and the environment. This meant that one of the requirements for graduation at Northland College was a month-long canoe trip across the border route in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. And one of the requirements on this trip was to spend a few days solo camping. When we arrived at this part of the trip, we had to divvy up our group gear, as not everyone would be able to have a full camp setup. I ended up with a canoe, a tarp, a small cooking pot, quinoa, and honey. I was camping on an island that had been through a serious burn a few years back. There was no shade. The brush was thigh high and fierce to move through, and ticks were everywhere. Well, we can live for 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, and 3 hours without shelter in inclement weather. So I got to work. I immediately began building my brush shelter. I lined it with pine boughs to lie on and used the tarp to create a waterproof area off to one side. Shelter, done. I gathered firewood and kindling to cook over and made a little bear hang for my quinoa and honey using a stuff sack and some pea cord. Kitchen, good to go. I gathered water and boiled it for drinking. Water, check. I collected various items to use as toilet paper. I explored the island from tip to tip, found a sunrise and sun setting spot to sit at. It was about 2:30 p.m. in the day, on the first day. I had done all of that, and it was still only halfway through the first day. So why not take a nap, organize my stuff, get settled in? 3:30 p.m. I realized the only way this was going to work was if I ditched my watch. So I did. I buried it in the bottom of my pack, and in doing so, I found a few Sigurd Olson essays I'd thrown in. And so I began reading Olson's meanderings about how in wilderness we can turn into little children, how we can reconnect with ancestral roots and rhythms that our modern lives are too occupied to tap into. I read about his musings of something more beyond the horizon, the intrinsic value of all of life, and the importance of being present to the sights and sounds around you, which Canoe Country taught us to do. So it was here in my trip when I began to shift from doing to being. Doing is driven by tasks, deadlines, even perfectionism and ego. These aren't bad things. They are powerful. They get things done. We have to be in do mode from time to time. But being is characterized perhaps as being more open, listening. What are we called to? Thoughtfulness, being present in the moment. All of those things that are similar to play. So I didn't make plans for what would come next. I simply ate when I was hungry, slept when I was tired, and I allowed a kind of intuition to guide me. I noticed that the land across the channel from the island had a large grove of cedar trees. And I had learned that cedars were known as the tree of life. And they were one of the few things that had survived in this fire-scarred landscape because of their proximity to water. I had been drinking cedar tea and respected that this sacred plant was one of the sacred plants of the original people, the Anishinaabe. Without thinking too much about it, I hopped in my canoe, solo paddled over, and spent some time amongst the cedars. I began collecting boughs and then, with a prayer of gratitude for a tree, cut a strip of bark. I paddled back and began to strip the bark into pieces and twine them together into little cords. I wrapped a bundle of cedar boughs with the cords as a gift and a prayer for each person on the trip. Looking back, I find it so ironic that when time fell away, when the spirit of playfulness was allowed to lead, what rose in my consciousness, what consumed my time, was spiritual practice. For 3/4 of that solo trip, I spent time in spiritual practice. The gates of Lador. Within the national park system are much lesser known and often less visited areas known as national monuments. National monuments differ from national parks not so much in the way in what they include or how big they are, but in how they are formed. A president is not able to create a national park. That requires an act of Congress. But a president can create a national monument. One of these is Dinosaur National Monument that straddles Colorado and Utah. It includes 210,000 acres of canyons, rivers, and yes, an amazing assortment of dinosaur fossils. My brother was working at this monument, guiding whitewater rafting trips for the biologists doing fish surveys on the Green and Yampa rivers. And he got a permit to do a private trip through this land, through the gates of Lador on the Green River. Did I want to come? Yes. The red rocks of this canyon country, the arid environment, the sandbar campsites that we slept on, all had a way of stripping everything down to the elemental core. The rapids at Hell's Half Mile were wickedly strong. The sunrise on the canyon walls were artery blood red. There was a rawness in the beauty, an edge of wildness that reminded me that I was not the center of the universe and that the universe was so much bigger and more mysterious than I could ever imagine. Yet I almost didn't go on this trip because I couldn't get the time off of work. Now, I first accepted that I wasn't going to get to go, but then I realized that this trip was so much more than a vacation for me. I wondered if part of my work, my calling, was to be in wild places, to experience wildness, because it just felt essential. I felt a lure, like there was something there waiting. And so I decided to submit my resignation. If I couldn't get the time off, I would leave my job that I loved. But luckily for me, my supervisor found a way to okay my vacation time request after I did that. I was in. As if by some stroke of providence, our flotilla of rafts went through Echo Park and past the stunning Steamboat Rock on the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act. I had no idea this was going to happen. It's an incredibly difficult place to get to. It's totally remote. You cannot hike there. You have to come down on a boat. You can only put in to the canyon way upstream, but still Park Service personnel and wilderness advocates passed us throughout the day as they were going to celebrate in this spot. Because this is where, this very place was where the Echo Park Dam had been proposed, and the Sierra Club and the Wilderness Society came together to fight that proposed dam. They argued that it created an impairment which the National Park Act forbid. And this worked. It was a come from behind victory for the environmental movement that is said to have created a public awakening for the value of natural parks and wilderness areas. This paved the way for the Wilderness Act to be passed. And I was there to witness this place on this anniversary. As I floated past pictographs and tiny canyon ecosystems, I realized that this place had been there for hundreds and thousands of years before I was born, and would continue long after I am gone. Thanks to this intentional work, this deep, hard work to find rights for wildness. As Edward Abbey, a philosopher and writer, was fond of saying regarding dams and so-called progress in canyon country, there's a law against it, a higher law. Those are 3 meditations I wanted to share with you about time in wilderness. In his book, Practice of the Wild, Buddhist poet Gary Snyder explores the terms nature, wildness, and wilderness. He defines nature as the physical world and all its properties, while, quote, wilderness is a place where the wild potentially is fully expressed, a diversity of living and non-living beings flourish according to their own sorts of order. However, Snyder writes that wildness is different from nature or wilderness. It comes close to how the Taoists define the term Tao or the Buddhists define the term Dharma. According to Snyder, wildness is eluding analysis beyond categories, self-organizing, self-informing, playful, surprising. In some cases, we might call it sacred. In wilderness is where I found wildness. And wildness, in the way Snyder describes, eluding analysis, self-organizing, playful, surprising. I would add a bit morally ambiguous, cosmic, is what has come to define my understanding of the ultimate. Wildness is, for me, what some people call God. And I realized this calling I've had my entire life to connect people, not to quote unquote nature, not to quote unquote the environment, but I believe my call is to connect with wildness. My vocation, my calling in the world has always been and continues to evolve to be this work. These are the bedrocks, the roots that have formed what I bring to this internship with you all. I believe that what we call the sacred or the holy can be experienced. I believe that we are evolutionarily hardwired for connection, for religiousness, and we find this through spiritual practice. And I know that when we live our values into the world, when humans aren't at the center of the world and we act to honor those who have come before us and with thoughtfulness for the generations to come, that wildness flourishes. I look forward to this adventure with you, exploring ideas and actions, values compassion, exploring our own wild spirits, and this idea of wildness, which, as Snyder says, we might call sacred. Let it be so. Amen.